Hello, happiness abounder, and welcome back. As we are continuing our discussion all about progress over perfection, I want to dive into something that I struggle with all the time. I have a personality where I am an extremist. So I either am all in or I am all out. It's really hard for me to find a middle ground. But what I have found is that feeds my perfectionist tendencies. Because if it's not absolutely perfect, if I'm not all in, then it's not worth my time. And if it's not absolutely perfect, I tend to get burned out and then not touch it at all. And this has been the vein of my existence in fighting my perfectionism. So it's exactly what I want to talk about today. I want to share a story about how I was able to overcome perfectionism specifically on this podcast and maybe help you along the way too. So, that said, the podcast story. Some of you have probably heard this 100 times now. I think it is applicable across so many happiness areas that I discuss. However, when it comes to perfectionism, this is a biggie for me. So I wanted to do a podcast for years, for a really, really long time. And in fact, we just celebrated our 2-year anniversary of this podcast, which is funny because I say celebrated, it came, it went, and I just realized it's been 2 years. But that said, prior to starting this podcast just over 2 years ago, I wanted to do it for a really, really long time. And I kept on kind of stalling out. And what would happen is I would actually interview someone. I did 3 interviews for this podcast before I decided that wasn't a format that was going to work for me. So I did 3 interviews, and these interviews were great. Amazing speakers, amazing stories, great happiness techniques and expertise, fantastic. But what happened is that a 2-hour interview, when I would go in to edit it, it would take me 8 hours because I would have to have it perfect. So no pause could be too long or too short. There could be no ums, no uhs, no coughs, no stutters. And I was doing this not only for me, but for the person who I was interviewing as well. So it took an insane amount of time, mostly because I was obsessed with it being and sounding perfect. So I got burned out. I realized that wasn't a direction that was going to work for me, and then I stopped creating the podcast for a while. Now, those episodes were never published. I wanted to try it out before I actually hit publish, and this is the podcast for the world. Again, another perfectionist thing. So then, after a few months, I decided to try again. And this time I thought, well, I'll do the interviews, and I'll also do one episode, like one interview a month and one episode a month that was just me talking. And holy cow, that was worse. Because the idea that every hit, any time I did a podcast episode, would have to be a home run. Because it's only doing one a month and it was all on me. So what happened? The perfectionism came in and I just felt so overwhelmed, so exhausted, so anxious that it wasn't going to be a great episode and I'd only have one a month, so it was only 12 a year, and so they all had to be this phenomenally amazing, life-changing thing. So I stopped. Several months longer goes by. I'm like, man, I really want to do this podcast. I just don't know how to make it work for me. And that's when I realized that my perfectionist tendencies, my need for perfectionism, my all-in mentality was really hindering me from getting my goals. It was keeping me back. Now, like I mentioned yesterday, I'm not saying don't pay attention to the details or don't do a good job. It's not that at all. But find what works for you so you can overcome perfectionism and work towards progress. So, as you are familiar, in the case of this show, I scrapped all of that. I scrapped the interviews, I scrapped a really long episode once a month, and I decided, what would it take for me to make progress towards this every day? And what would it take to help me not feel this overwhelming pressure that it has to be perfect? And I realized that would have to be me doing a solo episode every single day. Because if this episode is not the absolute best thing I've ever put out into the world, I have a chance again tomorrow. And each episode gets progressively better in the way that I speak, in the way that I present, and the audience that I connect with. So in that being said, doing the podcast every day helps me work towards progression and beat back this perfectionist mindset that held me back for so long. I think from the time that I recorded my first interview episode to the time where I actually decided to go day to day and produce these episodes, which is the podcast as it is in this instance, I think it was 2 years. I'm not saying this was like, 1 week and then a few days and I overcame perfectionism. No, it was a really long time just towards the goal of creating a podcast. But what I found is that it wasn't about the perfection. It was about just getting started and about finding the balance instead of the extremes. Because the balance is that I found something that would work for me in my day-to-day for the last 2 years. I found something that would connect for me so that I could have progress over perfection. And that created balance. When I didn't have that balance of finding it and really just looking at that goal and saying, how will this work best for me so I can keep on going and not be crippled by perfectionism, that's when things lined up. That's when I had balance. But when I was in extremes of perfectionism, it was a roller coaster. It was a teeter-totter, up and down, up and down, up and down, all over the place. Like, I have this goal, but I'm so overwhelmed by the emotions of overwhelm and anxiety and pressure that I was putting on myself because I thought it had to be perfect. So every episode that I stumble, or that I cough, or that I sniff, or that I cry, or that I say or that 10 times, or I repeat the same thing 3 different times, now I have a way of embracing that and saying, hey, it's not perfect, but it's progress, and I'm getting better. And maybe I said that 3 times because it needed to be said 3 times for someone to truly understand and grasp the concept. So that is my story in one small instance of this podcast of choosing progress over perfection, to find that balance instead of the extremes. So, that said, I want to challenge you. I want to ask you, what is something that you have been holding back on, or that perfectionism has been keeping you from, that you truly, truly want? Think about it for a minute. I know there's something. Maybe it's you want to go live on Facebook. You'd create YouTube videos, create a podcast, speak on stage. Now, those are all like public speaking kind of things, but there may be something for you that you are not embracing because it feels in your mind like it's got to be perfect, and if it's not perfect, it's not worth it. And that is simply not the case. So think about what that is for you. And then I want you to dive into those thoughts of perfectionism. Say, okay, what would it take? How often would I need to do this? How soon would I need to start? What's the consistent cadence that I need to move forward on this so that I can have progress over perfection? And then how can I maintain that, right? It's easy to say, oh yeah, my first year of the podcast, I did it every day and it was progress over perfection. And then I took a month break and it was so hard to come back to because that perfectionist mindset seeped in. So I realized I had to take it a day at a time. I was addicted to perfectionism, even after a year of doing the podcast. So find that balance for yourself. Ask yourself, what are you not fully embracing? What are you not moving into because of perfectionism? And then ask yourself, what would I need to do to start? And what would I need to do to make progress every day versus seeking for perfectionism out of the gate? So I'm going to leave you with that today. I hope that this episode resonates with you. I hope that you are able to find that balance versus the extremes for progress over perfectionism. And I hope that this story of the podcast connects with you and helps you see that we all struggle with it, but you have to find the thing that works for you. So I challenge you to find that today. I hope that you have a wonderful day. And above everything else, whether it's progress or perfectionism, I need you to remember that you are capable of happiness abound.